Okay, so hi. I wanted to thank you, Dr. Stavans, for coming here today to the University of Washington and agreeing to briefly talk to us about your experience with Hebrew. As a Hebrew teacher myself, I found it really interesting that you've decided to dedicate this book to your fourth grade Hebrew teacher, Mrs. Rubenstein. So I was just wondering, why did you mention her and how did she influence you?
Yeah. Helena Rubenstein was a teacher I was in love with as a fourth grader. She used to dress in a beautiful way. She was very fashionable. And I looked up to her. I waited for the class to start. I think I had a crush on her. And I don't remember much of what she taught, but I learned. And so something magical happened. For me, having become a teacher, I look back and see the 3, 4, 5 teachers that were decisive. And if it hadn't been for them, if it hadn't been for Helena Rubinstein, I would not have started the journey that the book Resurrecting Hebrew talks about. Ironically, many, many years later, I would find Helena again. We would both coincide in our studies at the graduate school doing a PhD. She was at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, and so was I. And so we reconnected and became friends, which was even more wonderful.
You speak so many languages. Oh my God. Spanish and English, Yiddish and Hebrew.
Yes.
So I was interested to know, what is the role of Hebrew in your life? When did you learn this language? And did this relationship to the language change over the course of writing this book?
It's important for me to tell you that a life in many languages is a life that is full of different types of excitement. Every language offers you a different set of glasses. It is the same world that you're looking at, but you perceive it through a different lens, through a different prism. And it is the quality of the syntax, of the grammar, of the morphology, simply the texture, the music, the rhythm of a language that will ultimately define how you are experiencing the universe at that particular point, and also how you will remember it. So if I had to look back, Hadar, at my past, I would tell you that there are specific chapters, and each of them are defined by the language that was the dominant one. There was Spanish. I played soccer with some neighborhood kids. I grew up in Mexico City, and Spanish was the language that enabled us to, as Jews, to communicate and to interact with the country as a whole. Yiddish was the private language, was the domestic language, the language that I spoke with my grandparents, with my schoolmates on certain occasions. And Yiddish was the language also that tied us to a certain kind of past, the past of Eastern Europe. My grandparents were immigrants from Poland and the Ukraine and Belarus. And so Yiddish was a bridge to the past. Spanish was very much the feet that we had on the present. Hebrew was the third language, and Hebrew became a language identified in my mind and in the mind of many of us in my generation as the language of the future of Jews. The Israeli state, I was born in the early 60s, the Israeli Republic was taking much of our mental space. It was such an exciting and forward-looking and a very unique experiment, social, economic, religious, military, and the Hebrew that I heard was very much about what was happening in Israel, another dimension in the present tense, one that some of us began to consider as a possibility to go and live there. And then came English. And English was the language of popular culture, of Hollywood movies, of music and the games that we had, and of restaurants and so on. And so for me, Hebrew is a very important language that connected me with a way of being Jewish that I was not experiencing in Mexico. And, another thing that I would tell you is that nothing is static in life. And so the perspective that I'm offering you was one of the initiation. Eventually, I would move to Israel for some years. I would live in Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, and I would experience Hebrew in a very different way. It was no longer the language of the future. It was the language of a present, a different type of present that I had. And a present that was a kind of parallel universe. Could I consider myself making aliyah, moving up to Israel and living there, giving up my Mexicanness, so to speak? What would that entail? And in that sense, it became a language that opened up, as in a science fiction kind of world or novel, a door to another Ilan that could, at one point, exist. I lived in Israel. I continued to go very often to Israel, and I came back, and instead of embracing Hebrew as a language of citizenship, I embraced Hebrew as a language of ritual, a language of literature. I love reading in Hebrew, particularly of poetry, and a language of friendship. Now, a language with which I communicate with some of my friends, or that I use as a stepping stone to communicate with many acquaintances and colleagues. For me, Israel plays a very important role in the way I see myself and I see the world.
Interesting. So you've written so many books, more than 30 books in Spanish and English. What about Hebrew? Do you plan to write in Hebrew?
I'm glad you asked. You know, I was telling you about citizenship. I think that the only true country of the writer is language. I am Mexican by an accident. My grandparents ended up in Mexico because immigration quotas for Jews at that point in the 1920s and early 30s were such that they couldn't come to the United States, or they were stationed in Cuba and eventually moved to different parts of Central America and to Mexico. So it's easier for me actually to say that I was born into the Spanish language than that I was born into Mexico. For some reason, I feel very comfortable in the Spanish language, and I feel very comfortable in the English language. And if I wrote a book in Hebrew, I would feel like an imposter. Or if I wrote a book in French or a book in Yiddish, I would feel like an imposter because I know the words, I know the syntax, I know the grammar, but I don't know how they feel from within. And I think a writer strives to feel the language from the inside, to feel that the language is not an instrument, but it is you. And so, for a variety of reasons, the two languages that I feel, maybe three, that I feel most comfortable writing in are Spanish, my first one. I never gave it up, I never will. And English, a language I came as an immigrant. And we're communicating right now, the language of my children, the language of my students. In Spanglish, a mix of English and Spanish, a hybrid that I love, that I see as the future of the Latino population in the United States, a kind of Yiddish of Latinos, of Hispanics. And I see myself as writing in Hebrew or in Yiddish only marginally, not a short story or not an essay, but maybe a letter or something that will not define me as a writer. It's because I think that, as I was telling you, the true country of the writer is language.
So is it good to say that Hebrew was your language of the future becomes the language of the past, and English became the language of your future?
Yes, if life is a house of mirrors, you don't know where you are until you start moving. I never chose to come to the United States until the moment came where I made that decision. And I never really realized, not consciously at least, that I would become an English language writer. In fact, sometimes I wake up and tell myself, really, is this you? What happened with Ilan that was speaking Yiddish or Hebrew or Spanish? But life takes you in different directions. And Hebrew is not the language of my past. Hebrew is the language of an aspect of me
Okay.
that is there, that I cherish.
In your book, you were talking about your guide in Israel. He gave you a recording of Ehud Manol's song, I Dream in Spanish.
Yeah.
In which basically the singer says, I can speak and think in Hebrew easily, but I still dream in Spanish. And this guy tells you that you're the opposite of that person. Is it still true? Do you dream in Hebrew?
I dream in Hebrew, but not always. And what happens to me, Hadar, is that often in my dreams, I don't hear the language that people are talking, that people are using. I know that they are communicating with one another. There's obviously not subtitles or anything of the sort, but I can't hear the language. And this might be, I have a brother who's a musician, and he conceives of the world in musical terms, in sounds.
Mm-hmm.
So he in his dreams have sounds. His dreams are musical. My dreams are about images and are about meaning, the symbols. I don't know if this plays along other people as well. Everybody dreams in a different way. And yet I know that there's something essential of the Hebrew language that always comes back in these dreams. And this is because, Hadar, the Hebrew language for me is not only, over time, I've realized not only what the Israeli state is, it's the language of the Jewish diaspora. It's the language with which the Jews communicated with God, and it's the language of the Bible along with Aramaic. And so it's a language that really is vertical, connecting us with the divine in a way that no other Jewish language does.
It's interesting because it sounds very much like what you mentioned in your book about what Eliezer ben Yehuda,
Yeah.
who was a visionary who helped pioneer the idea of reviving or resurrecting Hebrew from this ancient written language
Yeah.
to a modern tongue. And you're saying that for Eliezer ben Yehuda, Judaism is Hebrew.
Yes, it was. Eliezer ben Yehuda, a Zionist prophet, a visionary, the way you call him, is a man of his time. He had a very condescending approach to the diaspora. The revival of the Jewish people in the state of Israel was not only the beginning of normalcy for Jews. We would finally be a nation like other nations. We would not have to be renting space or living in somebody else's backyard. We would have our own country with our own government, with our own police, with our own prostitutes, with our own industries and so on. But also for Ben Yehuda, it meant that the diaspora would conclude, that the image of the Jew as dependent on others was coming to a close. And one of the fascinating moments, one of the fascinating chapters in the history of Zionism is why, while the majority of those that were instrumental in the shaping of the Jewish state spoke Yiddish, Yiddish being the language that literally defined the Jewish people in the second half of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, why didn't they choose Yiddish to be the language of Israel? I mean, they could all get together in cabinet meetings, there are jokes about this in Israel, and simply do everything in Yiddish, or they could begin in Yiddish and switch to Hebrew back and forth. But Ben Yehuda represents the decisive approach of no, we're going to refute, we're going to close this door, we are going to do something that is Zionism at its core. We're going to reinvent the wheel. And we're going to do so by going back to the Bible and saying, of all these words that the Bible had, which ones can we use? How can we adapt them? And what do we need to do to bring up other words and become a modern nation? It is miraculous. It goes against logic. Yeah. It is astonishing. You go to Israel these days and you think, really? People don't even realize how complicated an effort that was to bring. It's as if all of a sudden you and I decide that we love Latin and we are going to create a Latin republic in Sicily or in Naples. And we're going to have Dante as one of the major figures, or maybe Cicero and in the Ovid, and we are going to revive the Latin language and turn it into a national project. The amount of energy that takes, of a time investment and ideological drive. It's astonishing. The revival of the Hebrew language is astonishing. Now, from the revival to what has happened with the Hebrew language in Israel, that's another story.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So basically, so you said that you were born in Mexico.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested to know how the Jews in Mexico today, or other Latin American countries, experience Hebrew today, and how do they learn it in school, or is it still considered to be the synagogue language? And what about Yiddish?
Not too many years ago, Hadar, I read a piece in the New York Times in the opinion section that was enlightening. It was by a German intellectual, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, who had spent some time in New York at that point. This is, I think, in the 90s. And he said that he was struck, he was mesmerized by the presence of German in American television. Mm-hmm. He said that German had been turned into a language of the Nazis, and only the Nazis. And when you hear this guttural German language on U.S. screens, it's because you are going to be seeing Nazis destroying the Jews or fighting in a Steven Spielberg movie. Hebrew, ironically, is playing, for a variety of geopolitical reasons, a similar and very painfully so, twist or presence. Hebrew in the non-Jewish imagination of Latin America is a language of aggression. It's a language of militaristic opportunism. It's a language of colonization. It's a language of oppression. But not for the Latin American Jews. Latin American Jews often, sometimes in spite of themselves, have to come to the rescue of Hebrew as a language that is not only in the synagogue, that is not only for ritual, but is the language of the Israeli state. And I say something sometimes in spite of themselves, because some of them, like any Jew in the diaspora, might have an ambivalence toward the Israeli policies in the West Bank or in Gaza or in general. And so you end up being a bedfellow with someone with whom you have an ambivalent relationship, a love and hate. For Latin American Jews, Hebrew is a language of religion, or a language that appears in the public sphere that they need to defend without sometimes knowing exactly what they are defending. And this is the kind of bipolar life that one lives in Latin America and other parts of the world as a Jew connected with Israel and Israeli politics today.
Interesting. So the same education that you got when you were growing up in Mexico, do they offer this to Jews?
They offer, the Jewish education remains strong in Latin America. In some countries, Mexico, Brazil, Yiddish continues to be taught, although at a much more limited fashion than it was in my generation in the 60s and early 70s. Hebrew has replaced it, but language learning in Latin America among Jews is something that not always happens in school. It happens during summer trips to Israel or during periods of staying with family in Israel and so on. Many Latin American Jews are polyglots, no doubt about it. I don't know the percentages here. I wouldn't say that Hebrew is a language that they have embraced as a for practical reasons. As any other citizen of the world, one learns a language not necessarily out of love, but out of practical need. Mm-hmm. What is the language that is going to enable you to do business? Mm-hmm. What is the language that is going to, if you want to go to the diplomatic service, that is going to be able to bring you a job? Mm-hmm. And so Hebrew has a limited, even more Yiddish, but Hebrew has a limited sphere of influence. And the fact that many Israelis speak English makes it sometimes cumbersome or unnecessary. But there's a beauty in the Hebrew language that once you start using it, you just feel like it palpitates in you. You know that when you do that, you are not only a speaker in the present, but this is the language that Maimonides used. and this is for writing. This is the language of the biblical times. This is the language of Talmudic discussion. This is the language of political debates in the 19th century. We don't speak a language only with our contemporaries. Mm-hmm. We speak a language with those that came before us and those that come after us. We are part of a long chain, and the words are little jewels that are deposited in us. This is the word bima, or this is the word chalav, and that word has been used by others before you, and you have a responsibility toward that word. We have responsibilities toward the words we use. The ones that came before us had those responsibilities, and the ones that come after us too. And by using those words, we connect to all of them. We connect to the past and we connect to the future.
Talking about Eliezer ben Yehuda, I'm curious to know how do you come to view Eliezer ben Yehuda while you were writing this book?
Yeah. Eliezer ben Yehuda has the...
He was a genius, and then he was a crazy person.
He was an absolute zealot and lunatic. But you have to be a lunatic in order to have a dream like the one he had, to reinvent a language almost literally from scratch by going back to the Bible, by forbidding your children to use any other language except for this one that you were now bringing back from the dead. In spite of all the psychological damage that you would do to your children. His very first child ended up becoming a journalist, but he talks of the experience of suffering, not being able to play ball with the neighbors because everybody spoke different languages, and his parents did not want him to use anything but Hebrew. It was a kind of a determinism. It had to be this way. Ironically, what happens to heroes is that they become names of streets, they become names of schools, they become statues on which pigeons come and poop. And you wander around Israel today, and people, if you ask them who Eliezer ben Yehuda is, as I do with taxi drivers or with waitresses, they tell you it's a street. Most cities have a street, the Ben Yehuda street, but they don't know the story behind it. And that is because Israel has grown so fast. In 60 years, Israel has navigated what other countries go through 200, 300 years. Yeah. And that has come at the expense of keeping in contact with its history, with knowing what the past was. So it takes an effort to remind Israelis who their visionary figure, Eliezer ben Yehuda, is or was. And as in all cases, the figures of the past need to be reinvented themselves. The new Israeli will not feel toward Ben Yehuda what the first Aliyah did in embracing this idea of Hebrew. They will have to rediscover him at some point, the way they will have to rediscover. When I was growing up, Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir, they were canonical figures. One goes to Israel today and they are in a stamp or they are in a poster, and not many people know about them. But the task of television, the task of the historians, the task of classrooms like yours is to show that history is alive. It's not dusty, it's not dead. And that everybody, the new generation, goes back to it and rediscovers it in a way that is different from the older generation. The way Halina, my fourth grade teacher, related to Hebrew is different from my way. And it will be different from my students' way.
So, it's interesting what you're saying, because I'm going to teach a course in the spring quarter here at the University of Washington about the history of the language and the history of the cultural aspect of Hebrew, and talking about Eliezer ben Yehuda, talking about Jewish holidays, and talking about how it started as a lunatic idea, and now it's a living tongue, and everybody are using it in Israel and in certain part of the world as well. So it's fascinating, and I hope we can have you as a guest lecturer in the class again.
I salute you for teaching this course. I think it's going to be enlightening not only to your students but to yourself as well. I look forward to hearing what the students do and what you do, and it would be my pleasure to participate in any role while the course is taking place.
That's
so please bring me in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ilan, for coming here today.
My pleasure.